Thank you for that. You haven't heard the talk yet, and you're applauding me, which is good. Thanks ever so much. First of all, I'd like to say I really like small local literary festivals. There's nothing beats them in my view. I'd just like to thank Lucy and Jim in particular, and all the other people whose names I can't remember, but for inviting me and putting it on, and it's all working swimmingly. So they're obviously pedaling like mad underneath the water. As was mentioned, I write books about explorers, primarily Irish explorers, and it is worth emphasising that the Tom Crean story is probably the best known one. Nearly all these men, and they were men at that stage, were unsung heroes themselves. And part of that comes from very brutally simple fact, is that every single expedition to the Antarctic or the Arctic sailed under a British flag. There were no, until more recent times when there have been Irish expeditions. So all of these expeditions, all these exploits of people like Scott and Shackleton and all these other guys, they were all sailing under the British flag. And of course, come 1922 onwards, these stories were not passed on and these men became forgotten. Tom Crean is a very good example, and there are others. And one of the unsung heroes is this man Francis Crozier, who to me is one of the great stories. It's slightly different to Tom Crean, it's an earlier era, but it is a remarkable and dramatic story, and it has two unusual features. Most stories about the ice and snow involve rather tough, brawny men with beards and pipes and woolly hats, and there are very few women in it. The women left behind, of course, but they don't really influence the story. The story of Francis Crozier, however, is different. It does involve female interest, and I'll come to that because, it's an intriguing aspect of the story. And it's something, after, when I finish speaking, you might want to ask some questions, and I'll happily answer it because it is a very big story. The second thing is that Crozier is a remarkable character in many ways because he sailed on 6 expeditions to the ice in the early 19th century, almost entirely with sailing ships, entering the pack ice in a sailing ship. Just for comparison purposes, but to put it into perspective for you, Captain Scott, who's possibly the most famous, certainly British polar explorer, he sailed on 2 expeditions. Crozier did 6, and I won't say nobody knows about him, but people don't know about him anywhere near as well as they should. And I'm hoping that I can put this to right with this story and to tell you a little bit about Francis Crozier. And then finally, on just for the introductory purposes, history has an odd thing where you have a story, it happens, full stop, end of book. This is unusual because this story keeps on giving, and there are now quite major and significant updates to what's happened in the Crozier story, which as well I'll come to, and hopefully raise your interest. But I'll march on a bit and start by saying it seems a very odd day to be talking about ice and snow in this beautiful autumn day. But I was reminded as I was walking up here, I was doing a talk actually on Tom Crean in England where I live, and you know what happens. Overnight there'd been a very light fall of snow, and the phone rang just as I climbed out of the shower, and I was just about to dart off, and the lady picked up the phone and said, "Is that Michael?" I said, "It is, yeah. Good morning, how are you?" She said, "Look, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to cancel." And I said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "Because of the snow." And I said, "Do you realise the irony of what you're saying?" And the scary thing is she didn't. I had to explain it to her. But anyway, we'll gloss over that, and we'll march on with the story about Francis Crozier. Let's start by showing you, this is the only photograph of Frances Rawdon Moira Crozier. The only photograph in existence, taken in 1845, in the dawn of photography, really. And he wasn't a very happy man at this point, and I'll come back to that in a second. But this is the only image we have of him. We know roughly what he was like, clearly. He was an expert seaman. He was what I would call a maritime scientist. He was great on astronomy, on navigation, and on magnetism. And he was born in this house in Banbridge, County Down, and his father was quite a wealthy solicitor. I wouldn't say they were filthy rich, but comfortably off. Very large family, 13 children, or obviously no television in those days, and all the boys went into either the law or the church. The father was the solicitor for the landed gentry. He worked for the Downshires, for example, who owned a large chunk of that area in Northern Ireland. So very comfortably off. And then something strange, we don't know why. I've never been able to track down why. But Frances, at the age of 13, is sent off to join the Navy. And this is 1810. Might not mean very much to you, but 1810, Britain is at war with Napoleon. This is a brutal encounter. You send your 13-year-old son off to join the war. In those days, the ships lined up against each other, opposing, and just blasted each other till somebody surrendered. It was truly awful. And to put this into perspective, this 13-year-old, during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain lost 90,000 sailors in the space of about 10 years. And somehow Frances Crozier survived this. It really was a brutal... Funnily, I say funnily, it's not funny at all. Strangely enough, nearly all of the sailors who died didn't die from gunshot wounds or cannon shot. They died from disease like scurvy and TB or wounds because they had no medical treatment if they were wounded, splinters from the cannon. Well, Frances survived that, and in 1814, this is just a little funny aside, but you might be interested in. In 1814, he's serving as a junior officer on a British Navy ship, and he's sent in pursuit of an American ship, which is harassing the British Navy. And at that time, Britain was at war with America. And this ship had gone around Cape Horn and was out in the Pacific. So they went in pursuit of it. They missed it, couldn't find it, and they turned around and came back home, which meant coming around the Horn again for the second time. Unfortunately, they got lost. The navigation wasn't perfect. And one day they woke up and saw in front of them an island that wasn't on any charts. Nobody knew what this island was, what it was called. A very small island. And so they decided to go ashore and get some fruit and some fresh water. And as they were rowing ashore, they were astounded to see people coming from out of the island to greet them. They were even more astounded when the people spoke perfect English. This is in the middle of the Pacific in 1814. And what they had discovered was the last survivor of the mutiny on the Bounty, who was living in this idyllic southern ideal surrounded by lots and lots of dusky maidens, and he was the only man, so he must have been fairly popular. He had changed his name, was called something like John Smith, and they tried to persuade him to come back with them, where he would have been summarily executed. But somehow he chose not to, and he stayed on the island. He was the last survivor of the Bounty. And so Frances Crozier had that little brush with history. As I say, it doesn't really take us very far, but it's a nice little episode, I think. Anyway, so come 1815, the war with Napoleon is over. Britain has defeated all its enemies, more or less. They had nobody left to fight. And it is the beginning of the 19th century, the British dominance. And they dominated largely because they had this incredibly powerful and very well run navy. But they had nobody to fight. They had over 100,000 sailors doing nothing. Dozens and dozens, hundreds of ships doing nothing. So what do? Well, they threw all the men who'd been press-ganged, they threw them back out onto the quays. They weren't interested in them, but they couldn't do that to the officers. The officers had a kind of form of a contract with the Navy. And so they were put on what's called half pay, which is pretty much that. But there were dozens and thousands of officers with nothing to do. What do you do with them? Enter this man. This is John Barrow, and he's a key figure in the history of polar exploration. He was the chief civil servant at the Admiralty. He ran the Navy. You would have had elected ministers come in to run the Navy in the same way any country would have elected ministers, but the civil servants were permanent. He served in the Admiralty for 42 years as the top civil servant. He was, I always like to describe him as Sir Humphrey out of Westminster. He was an immensely powerful man. He's the last man to see Nelson before the Battle of Trafalgar. He's the man who decided that Napoleon should be sent into exile, not executed, but sent into exile. And when he retired, his colleagues gave him his desk as a going-away present, because this was very symbolic. From behind this desk, he wielded enormous power and influence over the Navy. And so in 1816, he gets the bug, we're going to go exploring. I'm going to put these sailors to work. And so they revived the plan to go exploring. And at that time, Britain had, I can only describe it as an obsession with the Northwest Passage. Now, for those who don't know, a bit of history, you can see where Britain is. Britain spent 350 years looking for the Northwest Passage and failed miserably. They got quite close, but didn't get the coconut. The Northwest Passage arose because in the 16th century, when the first expeditions were sent, the high seas, what is there, the Atlantic Ocean, were run by the Portuguese, the Dutch and the French. The British at that time wasn't as powerful a navy as it later became. If you wanted to reach the very treasured lands of China and India for spices and other riches, you had to go around Cape of Good Hope in Africa, but you couldn't because you'd get trapped by the Dutch or the French or the Portuguese. And so Britain decided they would go the other way. It sounds easy, but like I said, they spent 350 years looking for it. For the next 30 years, Britain sent an armada of ships to find the Northwest Passage, and they created a sort of a dynasty. Somebody wrote a lovely book called Barrow's Boys, and it was John Franklin, Parry, John Ross, James Clark Ross, George Back, John Richardson. These were very famous explorers of a whole generation, and they were created because of Barrow's enthusiasm. And here we have an idea. Just for record purposes, the Northwest Passage at that time, there was just one. It's right down here. And eventually you'd come out in the Pacific. Today, I'm told, there are 7 Northwest Passages. You can go on holiday through the Northwest Passage if you want. So this was the target. And in 1821, this is Edward Parry, who was the most famous British explorer of the time. He recruited Francis Crozier as a junior officer. And between 1821 and 1827, he went on 3 expeditions with Parry, one of which was to try and find the North Pole, which they got absolutely nowhere near. But These were huge expeditions. The British approach to exploring was a bit like taking home from home. They never learnt to live off the land. They never learned how to hunt. They never learnt how to drive dog teams. They never learnt how to build an igloo. They took servants with them. They ate off fine-boned china with cutlery with their initials on it. And they drank fine wines. And they never learnt how to speak to the Inuit. They didn't disrespect them, they thought they were children. They didn't take them seriously. We'll come back to that because it's an important point. And this is Francis around about the 1820s. We don't know precisely, but this was him as a junior officer during this period. And he goes through these series of expeditions, and then you come really, I have to go fast forward. Here's his best friend, James Clark Ross. And when I said that Francis Crozier was prolific, let me tell you, James Clark Ross, who was Francis's best friend, he served on 9 expeditions to the ice, which is remarkable. He was an incredible character. And somebody once said, I'll leave the ladies in the room to... He was... Oh, hang on, it's not that bad. He was said to be the most handsome man in the Navy. I'll leave you ladies to sort that out. But he was Francis's best pal. In 1839, Barrow, who is still wielding enormous influence, decides to switch the focus from the north to the south. And he sent a party to the Antarctic. And this is the first real attempt to explore the Antarctic. It had only just been found and discovered. And again, I suspect you probably don't know this, the first person to actually set eyes on the Antarctic continent is an Irishman from not far from here. And I'm sure you've never heard of him. Edward Bransfield came from a place called Ballinacurra near Middleton in Cork. Sorry to mention Cork in Wexford, but there we are. Well, 20 years later, these guys go off, and this expedition, in my view, is the greatest single expedition of maritime discovery in the 19th century. They were gone for 4 years. And these are sailing ships. They broke through the pack ice. I don't know whether you know, but Antarctica is surrounded by ice for much of the year. You've got to work your way through this. It's like a girdle, if you can imagine, around the continent. And as they were sailing through the ice was closing behind them. So they could only go one way. They had no engines, remember. And they broke through and they found the Antarctic continent. And they discovered places which became familiar. If you've read any books, for example, if you've read An Unsung Hero about Tom Crean, the geographical names were given by that expedition. This is Mount Erebus. This is the Ross Sea. And there's a place called Cape Crozier. And if you've ever read or heard of that very famous book, The Worst Journey in the World, it's about Captain Scott's last expedition, that's written about Cape Crozier. And they, as I said, they were gone for 4 years. An incredible ordeal, but it also introduces the feminine touch which I mentioned earlier. On the way down to the Antarctic, they stopped in what was then called Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania to you and me. And the governor of Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, in those days was John Franklin, and he was one of Barrow's boys. He was one of the explorers. Van Diemen's Land was a prison colony. It was actually full of Irish prisoners as well. It was where they sent you if you had broken any laws. Possibly 80% of the population were either prisoners or ex-prisoners. John Franklin was an explorer. He wasn't a jailer. He found it very, very uncomfortable being in charge of this lot. But he took with him his wife, Jane Franklin, who we'll come back to in a minute, and he took with him his very attractive niece called Sophie Craycroft. And Francis was smitten with Sophie Craycroft. And it is said, we have no written documentation on this, but he asked her to marry him. And she rejected several attempts at marriage, several proposals rather, at marriage, on the basis that her uncle, John Franklin, was an explorer, and she could see the effect of what it was like to be an explorer's wife. Remember, this is a 4-year expedition. And so, as somebody said so brilliantly, she liked the man but not the sailor. So she rejected his proposals of marriage, and off they sailed. Now, I really could keep you here all day just talking about this expedition because it's groundbreaking. But there is one episode which tells you an awful lot about Francis Crozier. It is worth emphasising here that Britain, like I keep saying, had this very, very powerful, very experienced navy. Best in the world. Nobody wanted to fight the British Navy. James Clark Ross was given command of this expedition, and the Admiralty said to him, you can have anybody you want and anything you want for this expedition. And he chose Francis Crozier as his right-hand man. So Ross took HMS Erebus and Francis took HMS Terror. And it's worth emphasising, again, for those who are interested in the maritime side of it, these ships were what they call mortar bomb vessels. And this is relevant because they didn't have the classic V-shaped hull. They had something we're all after, a round bottom. And the idea was to withstand the recoil of these massive mortar guns. So when they fired, the ship would roll. The conventional ships were potentially going to tip over from the recoil of these huge mortars. So they took these flat or round-bottomed vessels, and they were great in the ice because you could go at quite shallow depths. On the high seas, they were like a cork. They were being thrown around in a terrible state. And this one episode, which I'll tell you, tells you everything. They were heading back out of the Antarctic, and in the middle of the night, they were struck by a hurricane. And remember, these are sailing ships. And the two ships were running alongside each other, and Ross saw coming out of the darkness a row of icebergs, perhaps 200 feet high, and they were both heading for the icebergs. They were going to collide with the icebergs. And so he turned his ship. Crozier didn't see it and missed the icebergs, and the two ships collided, and their rigging became entangled in each other, and they were being thrown up and down in this hurricane in the middle of the night in freezing conditions. And Francis, very, very cool-headed man that he was, saw an opportunity. A very small gap in the icebergs, and slowly the riggings became disentangled, and Francis turned his ship and steered through the gap. And it is said, remember, I keep emphasising, this is a sailing ship. It is said that as they went through the gap, you could reach out and touch the ice with your hands, and the ice was falling on the decks as they went through. And he stayed at the helm for this manoeuvre. And then when he got through, he signalled for Ross to come in. And they both survived, and they went back. And when they survived that, just about, they came back to Britain, and they stopped. Just an interesting episode that tells you something about this episode. They stopped in South Africa to refuel or get some food and fresh water. And they were quite celebrated characters. They were called the Two Captains. And they went to a reception, probably at sort of government house type thing, and there was a journalist there, a sort of gossip journalist who wrote about visiting dignitaries and whatever. And she noticed something odd about the two captains. When they were drinking, they held the glass in two hands. And she asked Ross, "Why do you hold the glass with two hands?" And he said, "That's what 4 years in the Antarctic does for you." And you notice I did that with one hand. They came back to Britain in 1843, and nobody gave a damn. They'd been gone too long. They were off the agenda. Nobody cared too much about the Antarctic. Ross wrote a book which actually wasn't very enthralling, and Crozier, by this time John Franklin and this woman Sophie Craycroft are now back in the UK, and Frances is now pursuing her again, and she's still rejecting him. And I don't know for sure, but I think in modern terminology, I think he had some sort of breakdown, because he was given a year of leave, which is very, very unusual, and he went off on he just rambled around Europe, really. Some of his letters which have survived, he writes about being very lonely and I've got no friends, all that sort of stuff, and he's clearly having a bad time. But whilst this is going on, John Barrow is now in his 80s and about to retire. And he thinks we'll have one last hurrah. We'll go and find the Northwest Passage. This time, there's only a little bit of the jigsaw left to find, and we'll do it. They've combed the Arctic. And this area, I should emphasise, is about the size of Europe. And it's frozen, and there's nobody there. So he puts together the biggest expedition they can find, and they dust off Erebus and Terror again, and then they look around for a leader for the expedition. And far and away the best qualified is Francis Crozier. Ross has now retired. Ross has got married, and his wife has said, "You're not going on another expedition." Everybody else has moved on. Crozier is the last man standing. So it's obvious that Crozier should be given the job, but he isn't. Jane Franklin, the wife of Sir John, goes to the Admiralty and effectively, emotionally blackmails them and says, I'm paraphrasing now, "But you'll kill my husband if you don't give him the job. You owe him something." And John Barrow is not a fit man. He's nearly 60, somewhat overweight, and he hasn't been to sea as a captain of an expedition for over 20 years. And so reluctantly, and against all their better instincts, they give the job to John Franklin, and hence it becomes the Franklin expedition. Francis is tracked down in Italy and is given command of Terror once again and second in command of the expedition. And he sails rather reluctantly. He's not wildly happy about John Franklin as the leader. Sophie Craycroft has again rejected another proposal of marriage, and they stand on the quays in London waving their handkerchiefs farewell. And this is them in May 1845. This is the biggest single expedition ever sent by Britain anywhere. It's 129 men, 5 years of supplies, and 2 very well-stocked ships, and they were never seen again. They all disappeared. They sailed across the North Atlantic. We pick up little bits of information here. They sailed across the North Atlantic, and they had a farewell dinner with a passing whaling ship that was working in the area, and the whaling ship took home their last letters. And I've seen some of those letters. They're very, very poignant, very moving stuff. And Francis's letters to James Clark Ross are very personal. He talks about being very lonely. I've got no friends on the expedition. And he's obviously pining for Sophie Craycroft. And he's uneasy about the whole enterprise. And crucially, buried away in the letter, he mentions the critical fact. He says, we've sailed too late. And what he means is the Arctic season is very short. You've only got about 8 to 10 weeks of a year when you can navigate. And if you leave London too late in the year, you're going to miss the navigational season. So they go into the Arctic. In the first year, they winter on a place called Beechy Island. Tiny little place, very, very remote. And 3 men die in that. And they die, we know fairly well, because only a few years ago their bodies were exhumed. Because they're buried in the permafrost, about this deep. And curiously enough, one of the men who carried out the examination of the corpses was a descendant of the man that he was looking at. So he was talking about looking back in time. It's really kind of quite a spooky story. But anyway, they saw this, but they didn't die of anything. They died of what you might call Victorian diseases, probably TB, that sort of thing. So they were gone now for nearly 3 years before anybody woke up they might be in trouble, because they had left London on a sea of wild and over-enthusiasm. They were so confident that they were going to find the Northwest Passage, they didn't provide any backup. They didn't provide anybody to go searching for them. There was no plan to go looking for the expedition. And it wasn't till 1848 that they went looking. And this is the roll call of the great and good of British polar exploration. I mean, I won't go through the names, but James Clark Ross is here. And the odd one, or the 2 odd ones here, one is Barrow, looking down on them. He's been dead for 2 years, but he's still, in a sense, influencing them. And the other painting in the top left is John Franklin. But what we now know is that when this gathering was taking place, Franklin was already dead. And the man in command is Francis Crozier. And he's in command of a disaster. Because I just need to wander from the mic for a second. But they come in here, Beechy Island, and then they go north, and then they head south. In 1847. And if you look at that map, King William Island, at that time on all the charts, King William was called King William Land, because they thought it was attached to the mainland. And as they came down Peel Sound, if they'd gone left, they would have found the Northwest Passage, because the Northwest Passage is here. But they thought it was attached to the mainland, so they didn't. They turned right. And they went down the Victoria Strait, and the ships were trapped and never released. And so they then ate out another winter, with scurvy taking hold. And in 1848 or so, when the first expeditions were being put together to go search for them, they were probably down from 129 men. They'd probably lost about 30 already, had died from all sorts of diseases. France now faced a really massive conundrum. Should he stay on the ship and wait for the ice to break, or should he abandon the ships and strike out across the land with 100 men dragging boats, these huge rowing boats that weigh over a ton each? Well, he chose the latter. He chose to march overland, and he came ashore about here. And this is the Northwest Passage. So they probably saw it, and all those X's are where the bodies were found, because scattered all over King William Island are the remnants of the Franklin expedition. And how do we know this? Well, we know because of the Inuit. The people that the earlier explorers thought were children, actually the real children were the British explorers. The Inuit had no use for books and writing. There's no paper above the tree line. So nobody went to school in the conventional sense, but what they have, and still have, is a wonderful, wonderful tradition of oral history. They pass on stories. They make the Irish sound like slow coaches in telling stories, but that's how they pass on their history and their culture, is through stories, and they can accurately, very accurately, pass on information. And so in 1854, this man is a prolific explorer. He's a Scottish man. He was John Ray. He was a doctor, a very fine musician, and one of the best explorers of the 19th century. He is in the ice working for the Hudson's Bay Company, and he comes across a band of Inuit, and they're wearing British Navy uniforms and Navy insignia on their hoods. Not something you see every day. And he inquired, where did you get those from? And he's told, these are from the men who died on the march. So he says, show me. So they take him to where there are bones, hundreds of bones scattered in the ice. And what would have happened, I'm guessing this, but with reasonable accuracy, is that where the bodies, when they died, the bodies would have been ravaged by bears and foxes and other wildlife. So they're not identifiable humans in any respect. But John Ray notices one startling fact about the bones. They've got cut marks on them. Not teeth marks, cut marks made with a knife. Cannibalism. This, to Victorian Britain, was a bombshell, to say the very least. So John Ray packs his bags and heads back to the UK with the first information about the lost expedition, 9 years after they'd sailed. He comes home with this detail that he's found the bodies, he's found very credible evidence, the Inuit walking around with naval uniforms on, and cannibalism. Well, English society went ballistic. They would not accept that fine British Navy seamen would have resorted to cannibalism. There was a campaign of vilification against John Ray. There was a reward issued by the government for anybody who found information about the expedition. That was withheld. And there were campaigns in the media, it would never happen today, campaigns in the media against John Ray, and it was led by somebody called Charles Dickens, who was the editor of a very popular magazine at the time. And Charles Dickens wrote along the lines, I'm paraphrasing now, but along the lines of all Inuits are savages and you can't believe a word they say. So that was that. It is worth emphasising as an aside that during this period from 1848 to 1854, so 6 years, the British sent an armada of ships looking for the Franklin expedition. They combed the iceways, they mapped the Canadian Arctic, and they looked everywhere but the wrong place. The right place. They looked at the wrong place every time. This area, as I say, is about the size of Europe, but very, very few people in it, and it's clogged with ice most of the year. They searched everywhere. In fact, they sent so many ships that some of the ships got trapped and lost, and they had to send ships looking for the lost men. And there is one episode, which I think is quite interesting. It involves a man from Wexford, Robert McClure, and his ship was abandoned and was recovered many years later, and another ship called the Recluse was abandoned. And it was abandoned in the ice because they thought they were going to die. So they got off, all the men went off the ship and marched across the ice until they found another British ship that was looking for Franklin and hitched a ride home. That's fair enough up to a point. What happened, though, is that the ship, carried by the currents, drifted out into the Atlantic, completely empty, and was picked up by an American whaler. And the American whaler took it back to probably Maine, to the whaling stations down there, and repaired it and tried to put it to sea again. It didn't really work. And they alerted the American authorities about it. Now, Britain and America had had a very fractious period at this time. They weren't at war, but they were having a very uneasy time. And so the American president sent the ship back to Queen Victoria as a gift, a sort of hands across the sea in friendship gesture. When the ship arrives back in the UK, it's of no fit condition to be used as a ship. And Victoria ordered the ship to be broken up, and from the timbers, the finest craftsmen in England were asked to make 3 desks. And 2 of those desks are in museums now. The third one, you will have seen it, because it's in the White House. She sent the desk to the President of America, and if you see pictures of Joe Biden or Barack Obama, Reagan, Jack Kennedy, they're all sitting at the Recluse desk. And that's the desk that arose from the Franklin expedition. So anyway, look, I'm digressing too much. This is some of the artifacts, and it gives you some idea. This is some of the stuff found by John Ray on the bodies. This is what they were carrying. They weren't carrying food, they were carrying their cutlery. This, you can't read the initials on this, but the spoons were owned by Francis Crozier because his initials are on them, and they're in the Maritime Museum in London. They found on the bodies, they found books. They found their cutlery, like this. They found plates. They found gloves, things they didn't need. What they needed was food, but they'd never learnt how to live off the land, and so they slowly perished. During this whole period, Britain has now withdrawn the search for Franklin. We're at war with Russia. It didn't really matter. It was assumed they were all dead. And in 1857, Jane Franklin pays this man to go search for her husband, not realising that he's been dead for 9 years. This is Leopold McClintock. And McClintock, by coincidence, comes from Dundalk, which is about 30 miles from Banbridge. And one of his family later married into the Crozier family. Very good explorer. He goes north and he finds the only written clue to the fate of the Franklin expedition. And the crucial document is written by Francis Crozier. So he left behind the only clue. I'm afraid to read it, you're all going to have to stand on your heads, because unfortunately, Francis wrote the words here, and he wrote them upside down. This is a standard Navy document which was issued to all Navy ships, and it gave their position and the condition of the men and the commander and all that sort of stuff in various languages. And if you found this document, you sent it back to the Admiralty to alert them where the ship was. So he wrote in the margins of this what he was going to do. And what he was going to do was to abandon the ships and head south, looking for a settlement or for hunting grounds. Well, obviously they never reached them. And this is a very gruesome description. But what we do know from the Inuit testimony that followed is that these men literally died whilst walking along. Over 100 men will have perished. Some may have gone back to the ship. We don't know. Lots of speculation as to what happened to them. We just genuinely don't know. But what is odd is that in 1859, Leopold McClintock comes back to Britain with this written evidence and in effect closes the book on the Franklin story, or so you would have thought. From 1859 onwards until this very day, as I speak now, people have gone north into the Canadian Arctic in search of information about the Franklin expedition. Dozens of them. I've counted around about 50 separate expeditions, some official, some unofficial. People just gone to look for clues. In fact, the phrase I use in my book is that more people went looking for the dead than ever went looking for the living, because they were searching for over 160 years. And very few asked the obvious question, or the obvious people, was the Inuit. The Inuit, remember the oral history, they knew what had gone on because they'd witnessed it. But they were savages, they were children. Why would you talk to them? And it wasn't until around about the mid-1990s, so 140 years after the events, that a Canadian author and journalist began to interrogate the Inuit, later generations, but they had passed on the stories from the 1850s. They'd passed these down the line. And one of the crucial questions, what happened to the ships? Where are they? Did they sink? Were they crushed? And the Inuit, and I am paraphrasing now, forgive me, but for dramatic license, the Inuit said to them, if you look over there, you'll find the ships. They told them where to look. And guess what? They were right. And this is Francis Crozier's ship, HMS Terror. It was found in 2016. It's at a depth of 80 feet. And it's in very, very good condition. They found Terror, and you can see where they landed, where it says both ships are abandoned in the ice. The ship's Terror had drifted south of King William Island and Erebus a bit further south into the Queen Maud Gulf. And I spoke to the marine archaeologist who's leading the search. The Canadian government got involved in this for territorial reasons, because there's some dispute. Who owns the Northwest Passage? The Russians took a submarine up to the Arctic a few years ago and planted a flag at the North Pole on the seabed, claiming that they own the North Pole. To be debated, I'd say. So the Canadians were using this expedition as a kind of, the search for the expedition as a sort of a right, their own, of asserting their own rights. And in between time, Britain, for reasons that was never explained, gave the two ships to the Canadians. So although they were British-built Navy ships, they're now actually Canadian ships. So the British have no connection with them apart from the historical one. The ships, I'm told, are in remarkably good condition. For one reason, there are no bugs. It's too cold, so the bugs aren't eating the wood. The silt which has built up has kept them quite well preserved. And in particular, of course, it's dark. So it doesn't foster any life down there. And so the ships, as I say, are in remarkable condition. And I come to, this is Francis Crozier's quarters. As you can see, it is, excuse the pun, it is all shipshape, because Francis was a classic Navy man. He did everything by the book. So when they sent down a semi-sub camera, they photographed the inside of Terror. All the tables are made, the desk drawers are closed, the beds are made. It is as though these guys just got up yesterday and walked out. And this is the cutlery. The plates, all stacked up neatly. That's exactly how it was left. Even the windows were closed to make sure that nothing happened. And this, for me, is the crucial bit of evidence. This might look like a humble desk to you, and it is a humble desk. This photograph is taken inside the private quarters of Francis Crozier from Banbridge. And it's screwed to the floor, and so it hasn't been moving around. But I come back to Francis, the man. Francis was a navy man to his toes. He did everything by the book, which means that he kept records, written records, the logbooks, the diaries, the letters. And when I spoke to the marine archaeologists, they said they're probably in that desk. Something called COVID intervened, unfortunately, and so they weren't able to go searching for them. They've just resumed the search now, this year, as we speak. And I said to him, yeah, but they've been underwater for 170 years. You won't be able to read anything. He said, not a bit of it. We will be able to read. Now, I'm not a paper conservator, so I can only tell you what I was told. He said, with the aid of technology, you will be able to read. And being a cynical old bugger, I decided to go and ask the British Museum and the British Library and the Victoria and Albert Museum, the people who specialise in these sorts of things. And they all said, yes, if you get those documents up, with a fair wind, you will be able to read them. And so inside that humble little desk are almost certainly the clues to the Franklin expedition. And I like to think, and I'll come to an end now, and you may have some questions, I like to think that in there are also personal records. These men had months and months and months to contemplate their fate. In the Arctic winter, the sun doesn't rise for 4 months, so it's perpetually dark for 24 hours a day. They had nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no spare food. So they would have sat, Francis would have sat at that desk and wrote letters. He almost certainly would have written a letter to his best friend, James Clark Ross. And I like to think that in that desk is a letter to Sophie Craycroft. So I'll leave that. We wait the opening. So this is the story which keeps on giving. The story of Francis Crozier is not yet finished. You'll have to invite me back again at some other point. But look, I'll stop talking now. You might have some questions. But it is a remarkable story about a remarkable man. I hope you enjoyed it.